After suffering defeat at the Battle of Chickamauga, General Sheridan moves his troops to Chattanooga, where General Grant is working with Generals Hooker, Sherman, and Thomas to defeat General Bragg, who is commanding his army from a fortified higher ground position. Sheridan arrives after the first 2 days. Thomas had advanced slightly upwards in the middle of the line. Hooker was looking to attack Bragg's left flank, and Sherman was being held off on Bragg's right flank. Sheridan joins forces with Thomas, and their troops charge Missionary Ridge and break through the Confederate line.
They're at you.
That's damn ungenerous. I shall take those guns from you.
Sheridan continues to chase the Confederates to Chickamauga Station, but realizes he is alone and doubles back. General Grant then says, "To Sheridan's prompt movement, the Army of the Cumberland and the nation are indebted for the bulk of the capture of prisoners, artillery, and small arms that day. Except for his prompt pursuit, so much in this way would not have been accomplished." After this battle, Tennessee loses all Confederate control, and the Deep South opens up for Sherman's march. After the Battle of Chattanooga, Sheridan takes control of the Army of the Potomac's cavalry, and doesn't fare well in the few battles he is used in. Then, he is put in charge of the army and the military of the Army of Shenandoah. His mission was to defeat any troops there and keep any others out. The Union didn't want the Confederacy gaining any agricultural production out of the Shenandoah Valley, or using the area as a base to send raids into Washington and nearby states. After gathering troops for a month, Sheridan attacks and defeats the Confederates led by General Early in several small battles. As the Confederates regrouped, Sheridan sent his cavalry to destroy livestock and provisions, and to burn barns, mills, factories, and railroads. This group rendered over 400 miles of land uninhabitable. This act was known as the Burning, and was a presage for Sherman's march to the sea.
The tape. The tape should be fine.
Sheridan's burning presaged Sherman's march to the sea, and demonstrated the effectiveness of the scorched earth principles: burn, kill, and consume. Sherman's march, however, was on a larger scale from that of Sheridan's. While Sherman's march only covered the 300-mile distance from Atlanta to Savannah, it inflicted about $1.4 billion in damages in today's rates. It destroyed miles and miles of railroads, telegraph lines, and bridges. It seized over 22,000 animals, 5,000 horses, 4,000 mules, and 13,000 cattle, and it seized 9.5 million pounds of corn and 10.5 million pounds of fodder. Sheridan was then commanded by Grant to destroy the Virginia Central Railroad and to join Sherman in North Carolina. Instead, he recognized the end of the war was near, and he moved east to join Grant's Army of the Potomac. He wanted to be a part of the force that effectively ended the war. Immediately, he made his presence known. On April 1, 1865, he cut off Lee's final supply line at Five Forks and forced Lee to leave Petersburg, which he had held for over 10 months. 5 days later, at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, Sheridan, along with Humphreys and Griffin, forced close to a quarter of Confederate troops, about 8,000, including 8 generals, to surrender. This battle was considered to be the death of the Army of Northern Virginia, but the dissolved army continued to fight for 3 more days. Finally, on April 9th, the Confederates had moved to the small village at Appomattox Courthouse in an attempt to reach supply lines at Appomattox Station. This supply line was taken by the Union, and General Sheridan and his troops effectively blocked Lee's army from retreating to more supplies at Lynchburg. Later that day, Lee negotiated the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia with Grant. Lee surrendered to Grant on April 9, 1865, in the McLean House in the small village of Appomattox Courthouse. The terms of the surrender were generous towards the Confederates. The Confederates had to give up their arms, artillery, and public property, and the officers had to give their individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged, and each company or regimental commander sign a like parole for the men of their commands. But Grant was generous and allowed the soldiers to retain their personal property and allowed them to return to their homes to farm and work. He also gave them a small food ration. On April 12, 1865, all of the Confederates piled their arms up, and the surrender was complete. After Lee surrendered, the war was effectively over, as the remaining Confederate forces followed Lee's example and surrendered. Johnston surrendered to Sherman in North Carolina, Edmund Smith surrendered the Trans-Mississippi Department, and Stand Watie surrendered the final large Confederate force.